Games are funny. It's not necessarily the primary reason people play most games, but humor has been showing up in games more and more frequently ever since narrative has become such a strong emphasis in the industry. Obviously, what people find funny will vary from person to person, but in general, games have a higher volume of jokes in them than they did in the distant past. Many games employ humor in different ways. Games like Shovel Knight include humor as an incidental element of their narrative. Although these jokes don't do much to propel the story forward, it reinforces the existing charm that comes from the familiar gameplay. Duck Game also does this. A lot of the humor from this game will be had from the player's interactions, but Duck Game serves as a vessel for this interaction to blossom. For example, if upon brutally murdering your friend, you make your character let out a single quack, it's often the subject of many laughs. Other games have their humor as a driving force in the narrative. The Stanley Parable frequently breaks the fourth wall, and the narrator's general frustration with the player's decisions often leads to many guffaws to be had, especially for a game that would be lost without a narrative.
Yes, really worth it being here in the room. A room so utterly captivating that even though all your co-workers have mysteriously vanished, here you sit looking at these chairs and some paintings. Really worth it.
Octodad is also the source of a humorous story. The player takes the role of an octopus in disguise as a simple family man. The notion that nobody in the game's story recognizes that this is, in fact, not a person, but an octopus is absurd, but the game goes with it, so the player has to as well. Sometimes, however, the humor in a game can dramatically shift its tone. This has to be expected given the nature of humor. Look at Portal. Although there's a lot of humor in this game, it's all very subtle. The game has a strong, ominous atmosphere, and most of the humor is derived from GLaDOS or GLaDOS. GLaDOS or GLaDOS? Fuck! Alright. How to pronounce GLaDOS. I'm just gonna say GLaDOS. The game has a strong, ominous atmosphere, and most of the humor is derived from GLaDOS, a robot, and her inability to sympathize with the human experience, or the general juxtaposition of something happy she says mixed with the bitter taste of the facility.
Be advised that the next test requires exposure to uninsulated electrical parts that may be dangerous under certain conditions. For more information, please attend an Enrichment Center Electrical Safety Seminar.
But then look at Portal 2. GLaDOS still doesn't understand humanity very well, but she's a lot more human herself, saying things to intentionally attack the player's feelings. Her, along with the addition of downright hilarious characters like Wheatley and Cave Johnson, ultimately eradicate any sense of fear from the player's mind. It's hard to take anything seriously, especially when we get to see just how competent the boss is. It kind of kills any idea that Aperture could be a real place, but this isn't a bad thing necessarily. Although it eliminates realism and chills, the game's lighthearted mood makes it fun for different reasons. In a way, Portal made Aperture Science feel like a disturbing place with many chilling stories, but Portal 2 turned the facility into an amusement park, and that's fine, especially after seeing how the first Portal evolved into a cult classic, spawning memes like how the cake is a lie. It made sense to alter the game's overall feel. However, one has to wonder, can a game make you laugh based solely on its mechanics and not on its narrative? Well, in order to answer that kind of question, one would have to determine what makes something funny, something that could probably never be answered, especially since humor itself is often rooted in context. Obviously, it varies from person to person, but most humor comes from an expectation. Octodad is a prime example. We expect people to be able to identify an octopus living among them, but they don't. But this is a narrative context. Same is seen in Portal 2, we expect the owner of Aperture to be competent, but instead we meet a man who wants to use lemons to commit arson. How can a game be funny based on mechanics alone? Is it possible to separate mechanics from the narrative? Well, look back at Octodad and light games, QWOP, I Am Bread, Surgeon Simulator, Mount Your Friends. These games have extremely non-intuitive controls. In fact, in the cases of all these games, their immediate challenge comes from the mastering of these controls. But it's hard to claim that this humor is entirely mechanical. After all, it's funny to watch these games be played. In Octodad, we see an octopus tripping all over itself. In QWOP, we see an Olympic runner struggle to do something as basic as taking a step. In I I Am Bread, we see a piece of bread become sentient. In Surgeon Simulator, we see a doctor bumble to save people's lives. In Mount Your Friends, you see dick. These games are pretty floppy, and it's hard to gauge whether that humor is coming from the controls or the context surrounding them. Conversely, look at Goat Simulator. Obviously, it's funny that a goat is terrorizing a town, but a lot of the humor in this game comes from just how glitchy the game is. We expect games to run properly, but Goat Simulator was built with the intention of being an absolute mess, and it nails it pretty well. Again, one can't always be sure whether they're laughing at the goat or the infrastructure that the goat tends to break. We can look at glitchy games as the source of comedy in games where it isn't intended to, such as Sonic 06 or Big Rigs. These games are partially funny because we know they shouldn't be. Similarly, games like I Wanna Be the Guy take expectations that players have and throw them on their head. We expect games to work a certain way based on previous games we've played, but this one doesn't care and makes its own rules. This can be either frustrating or hilarious depending on the player's attitude. Humor comes from all sorts of places, and one can't say with certainty what is and isn't funny, but these are just a few examples of how games can pose a familiar context to the player before pissing on its own foundation. What are examples of humor in games you can think of? Can you think of any games that make you laugh for one reason or another? Leave a comment below, and that's the end of the video. I don't know whose channel this is going on.